Today, I'm going to be discussing one of the most harmful myths in Canadian society, and that would be that Canada is a country free of oppression, racism, and anything harmful. This, while being not necessarily accurate or true, may have started this belief or idea that Canada is a place just free from oppression where it's diverse, it's tolerant, there's nothing you could ever worry about. You'll never experience any form of racism in Canada, although that is pretty far from the truth. This myth does nothing but harm and stop the growth of Canadian society, especially in the light of systemic racism and oppression, which has been highlighted across North America in the past few months. It's important to talk about and not just ignore the issues that have been going on in Canada if we are to grow and to get past them and to reach a state as close as we can to equality. It's also important that this myth is rooted out in order to expel and abolish just sects of racism, bigotry, and horrid people that exist in Canada. This is especially important as groups which state themselves as being groups of white pride or just straight up groups which hate minorities, which are racist and oppressive, as there recently has been a resurgence in these sorts of groups. Now, who does this myth affect? And while obviously this myth primarily affects minorities throughout Canada, as they're the ones being oppressed, and they are the ones who are having racism directed at them, this also affects every Canadian citizen, as it changes the way that we live, behave, and act, in order to be more fair, more open, more diverse, and more tolerant to those around us, making sure everyone is comfortable in living the life they hope to. Now, where does this myth come from? And this myth comes from, I believe, a few different places. One area it could come from with that it could have sprouted from the myth that all Canadians are kind and they're only giving and caring to others, which has spread throughout just North American and Canadian culture. So people almost make the connection that Canadians are only kind and nice when there is a history and a current issue in our country about racism and oppression of minority groups. Another place this myth could have spread from would be as Canada being seen as a safe place from racism and a haven from oppression, as compared to the United States during the 1800s, as they were pretty terrible with slavery. And while there were still slaves in Canada, they were much more progressive about abolishing slavery, as slavery was abolished in 1834, much before it was abolished across America. And there were only 4,200 slaves, which is still horrible and terrible. But in comparison to what was happening in the US, people began to see Canada as where slaves escaped to, where they found haven, and where they were safe. But specifically, this myth harms minorities throughout Canada who experience this oppression. This dates back hundreds of years, whether you're talking about what, as I mentioned, the 4,200 or more slaves that existed right before the formation of Canada as a country, but on Canadian soil, as our ancestors were the ones owning these slaves, or whether you're talking about the 60s scoop or residential schools and how Indigenous people have been marginalized, oppressed, and experienced what was close to a genocide. And what I think has got to be probably the biggest example of oppression against a minority group in Canada has to be the residential school system and the 60s scoop, which targeted, oppressed, murdered, and just brutalized Indigenous people across Canada. If you don't know, what the 60s scoop in residential schools is that during the 1960s, the Canadian government decided that they wanted to turn the Indigenous population of Canada into what they believed to be real Canadians. So this meant stripping them of religion, beliefs, practices, their native languages, and turning them into the prototypical white British Canadian. This meant, in their eyes, that they must send them to residential schools. What happened at these schools is these kids were stolen and quite literally kidnapped from their homes and brought even sometimes halfway across the country so that they can be educated. And this education, most of the time, would include beatings and even murder. And even in the cases in which kids did not face this brutalization where they were beat or murdered, they would still be stripped of their identities, they'd be stripped of their religion, and they would just be taught that there's something fundamentally wrong with them for being Indigenous. While these residential schools started in the early 1900s, which is extremely recent, they only closed down very recently, with the last residential school closing in only 1996, meaning as of just 25 years ago, this was still happening. And now for who benefits from this myth. Some examples of people who benefit from this horrible myth would be racists, people who support the oppression against these minority groups, people who fit that general category. But an even bigger example of someone who is benefiting from this is simply, again, the Canadian government. If you're the Canadian government, you don't want your country being seen as a bunch of, well, oppressors, rapists, kidnappers, murderers. You don't really want it rotating through conversation as much that your country basically committed genocide against its natives. So obviously there are many groups that do benefit from this myth being widespread across Canada, but those are some examples of who benefits the most. I would argue this nation holds up the dominant Canadian identity, because with this myth, Canadians feel like since Canada is a non-racist utopia where nothing goes wrong, they can feel good about themselves. They're kind. They can't do anything wrong. They're Canadian. They're great. And I would assume that's how the Canadian government wants them to feel, but every Canadian most likely has had a slip up here or there where they've done something, or maybe they've had a microaggression or something, whereas also some Canadians have gone a little farther than that. And that needs to be acknowledged and that needs to be grown past, because it is pretty terrible overall. But Canadians can't be feeling a false sense of pride if they're not kind or tolerant. One group that's trying to stop this myth would be the Canadian Anti-Racism Network. They're an organization that's trying to put an end to systemic racism across all of Canada. And on top of that, they have a tool for tracking hate crimes across the country. Also, this is being resisted by many Indigenous groups, as there is a large part of the Indigenous community that wants to see lots of systemic change given what's going on, especially based on the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, and based on the recommendations of Indigenous groups like Idle No More. Now, an example of this myth coming up in pop culture actually comes from the Jimmy Kimmel Show. From a recent episode on June 6, 2019, there was a very prominent skit featuring lots of Canadians. And in this skit, Canadians are asked to trash talk an American basketball team. But it's heavily implied, and they make a large point of acknowledging that Canadians are too nice to trash talk a basketball team. They're too good people. All Canadians are amazing. But obviously that's not nearly the case, and it's enforcing myths like this and stereotypes that all Canadians are good and have the best intentions for everyone around them. And in this skit, the Canadians that do make fun of the team are just making light jokes and poking fun, because once again, Canadians are too good. They can never do anything wrong.
On the other side of the border, in this first ever international NBA Finals, it's been pretty low-key. Not that they aren't excited, but they're very excited. But Canadians aren't as, what is the word, terrible as we are. They are, as a general rule, polite and friendly people. But what happens when sports gets involved, when rivalries rear their ugly heads? We wanted to find out, so we sent a camera crew north to Toronto, and we asked Raptors fans to talk some trash, to give us the best of their worst, and, well, this is what we got.
Trash talk.
We're talking to Canadians and asking them to trash talk the Warriors. You ready? Trash talk.
No. You don't do that here.
And we are asking Canadians to trash talk the Golden State Warriors. You ready? Trash talk.
I would not do that against anybody. Canadians don't do that.
Let me hear you trash talk the Warriors a little bit. Trash talk.
No. We are polite. We are Canadians.
I mean, they're a great team. I don't think I can trash talk them. I think they're in the finals for a reason.
Why would I trash talk them? They haven't done nothing wrong to me or my team. All I'm saying is everybody's playing right. So if they want to win, they better play better than us. That's all I can say.
Pretty harsh, Lou.
Golden State ain't so golden anymore, huh?
Wow.
You're losing tonight. You're losing. That's it. That's my trash talk.
Trash talk.
Well, we're Trini, so we cook curry, so curry's gonna get cooked. Yep. Go to hell.
That's awful. That's terrible.
No, I don't mean
just mean I hope you don't win.
No trash. No. We'll console them when they lose.
Okay, ready? Console!
Console? Well, better luck next time. It's about time for Toronto to be number one. Hey, hey, hey.
My God, what kind of monsters are those?
Based on everything we've talked about today, it's pretty clear that one of the biggest issues that is happening in our country today in Canada is this myth that we are a nation free of oppression and there is no systemic change that needs to occur. Because clearly that's just not the truth. Whether you're an Indigenous or other minority that is fighting against racism and oppression to this day in this country, and fighting for the federal government to further acknowledge the crimes and horrible things they have done to people in this country for no good reason, then keep it up and good luck, because you got a fight ahead of you. So let's see growth and let's see change in this country, and all of it be positive.